Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. And he was one of a kind. He ruled his nation for 43 years, 605 to 562 BC. When his dad died, whose name was Nabopolassar, his young son took over a nation and a royal palace that was steeped in magnificence. I'll describe it for you. In the capital city, the main street was 65 feet wide, and it was paved with inlaid stone. The sidewalks on both sides were made of red brick. 3-story buildings lined the streets on either side, and they had colored tile designs on the walls in yellow and blue enameled brick, depicting life-size lions and dragons. Nebuchadnezzar's palace was a huge complex of many buildings, and they were protected by a double wall. His throne room alone was plastered in white, and it was the size of a basketball court. And he had great central entrance, massive doors covered in gold. The city of Babylon was rectangular in size, and it was built right along the banks of the Euphrates River. Surrounding the city was a thick wall, 85 feet wide. Horse-drawn chariots, 2 of them at a time, could pass each other on top of that wall, 5 stories high. Now, the wall was 11 miles long, and all the way along, about every 2 blocks, there were watchtowers. Inside the city, there were 43 temples to their idolatrous gods. The city of Babylon, there in that 6th century BC, had a population of 500,000 people. Now, the ruins of that city are still around. You can find them if you go there. Do you know who built a palace right next to those ruins? Saddam Hussein. He was the ruler, do you remember, of Iraq, whom the Americans fought in the Gulf War? I want to take you for a closer look over these next few lessons at the book of Daniel. It's composed of stories, and it's composed of visions, and they center around an Old Testament prophet by the name of Daniel. He wrote the book. And it all takes place in that setting that I just described. The opening part of the book, first 6 chapters, they deal with 6 stories. The tail end of the book, chapter 7 through 12, they talk about visions. There were 4 of them. And they tell of Daniel's obedience to his God in a time of calamity, and visions of his God's sovereignty among all those nations. Now, each of these stories are going to tell us that we have to also be alert in our day, as Daniel was in his. But when we read them, we're going to gather hope. And we're going to study Daniel, and we're going to see his visions, and when a nation is troubled, how did he handle that troubled nation? When we study Daniel's visions, we're going to see that God is still on the throne, and we can trust him, and he's going to bring all things and all people still under his rule. Now, the book of Daniel, it opens in chapter 1 with young Jewish adolescent boys being marched as fugitives from the land of Israel to be captives in Babylon. And the Bible tells us that these 4 young men from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they were among the selected for special training. These 4 teenagers were believers in God. And they manifested their conviction and also their trust in that God and their walk. Those qualities placed them on a fast track to be promoted among the Babylonian aristocrats and leaders. It says in verse 17 of chapter 1, God gave them knowledge and gave them intelligence in every branch of literature and in every branch of wisdom. Daniel even understood the kinds of things that would be in visions and also in dreams. Now the king, Nebuchadnezzar, he got wind of these qualities and he brought these men before him to have an interview. And to his amazement, these 4 Hebrew captives, they were 10 times better than all the top aides that he had within his realm. Imagine surpassing the understanding of the wisest men in Babylon. Now, these 4 men, they were elevated to the royal court. Now, that's a lofty position. But in that court, they're going to be tested. And their convictions are going to be challenged. How will their integrity stand up against a world of idolatry? Temptations are going to stare them right in the face. Now, you parents out there, you know what I'm talking about. You're preparing your children for the occasion when they're going to have to take their stand, just like Daniel did. But hopefully, they will commit themselves to the living God in a way, regardless of the temptations that they're living in. Daniel's going to teach us how to keep that commitment. Okay, let's jump into the story. Daniel chapter 2. Right off the bat, no sooner does Daniel finish his training in that high court of Babylon when he's going to find that his life is in danger. If it was anybody other than Daniel, I think he would immediately give up. Do you know that the number 2 killer among our teenagers here in Canada is suicide? Daniel's not going to quit, and he's not going to suicide. But he is going to face a predicament that is humanly impossible to solve. Well, you and I face a lot of that every day. I'll describe the predicament. Nebuchadnezzar the king is only into his 2nd year of his reign. One night, in his sleep, he faces a nightmare. He has a dream that wakes him up, and it's so vivid that it bolts him out of bed. And it's going to treat him very rudely. And he's going to turn it into a national emergency. He alerts his Secret Service, calls in the generals of his army, and he immediately summons his war cabinet. And you say, all of this because of a dream? Yep. I'm not done yet. It's going to get worse. But I'll give you a hint. God is in the middle of his dream. Does that not strike you a bit odd? Nebuchadnezzar, a heathen idolater, not a believer in Yahweh, but God finds in his head a dream, and he plants it there for his attention. Now, the war cabinet, it's summoned. The king is now in a rage over his dream, and things are going to really start heating up. The king wants to know the meaning of his dream right now and right this minute. And he's pacing the floor in front of his cabinet, and he's almost in a trance. They look at him, and he's talking to himself. Ancient societies were ruled by idolatry. And the center of idolatry, there's superstition. And they'll go to all lengths to find the answers to their troubled times. And even the practice of child sacrifice appears over and over in history. So what does the king do? Well, he calls in the priests. He calls in the magicians, all his fortune tellers, his conjurers, his sorcerers, every medium that he could lay his finger on, he tells, bring him in. I want to know the king's dream. Now, these diviners, they're going to use their witchcraft, and they're going to try and find their answers. Are you like that? Do you know that in every one of your newspapers this morning, you can read the horoscope? Well, that's what that is. It's superstition. And some people wouldn't get out of bed before they'd read it to see what's going to happen that day in their life. Nebuchadnezzar, he's not the first ruler to practice that. Did you know that Queen Victoria, she'd lock herself in her bedroom for days, and she would speak to the dead through their sorcerer? Well, so did Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd. She would lock herself in her bedroom to talk to the dead, contacting the dead to discover the future. Are you like that? I hope not. So the king says, to all these summoned, verse 3, chapter 2, I had a dream. My dream is causing my spirit to fall apart. I don't know what the dream means. And he just stares at them. They can almost see the fire in his eyes. He's so anxious. But what comes out of his lips next, I think would scare me to death. It begins with the fortune tellers requesting in verse 4, chapter 2, long live the king. Tell us, O your majesty, tell us your dream, and we'll interpret it for you. Now comes the threat from the king. No, I'm not going to tell you my dream because I can't remember what it was. I'm asking you to tell me what my dream was. And if you can't tell me both my dream and its interpretation, I'm going to rip you to pieces from limb to limb, and I'm going to destroy all your homes. But this is the part that I like. But, verse 6, if you tell me both the dream and its interpretation, I'll lavish you with gifts and honors. Well, isn't that nice? You tell me the dream, and you'll win the lottery. You're going to die if you don't, and you'll be wealthy if you do. Now, here's where this story gets a bit sticky. Verse 13. When the death warrant was issued, Daniel and his companions, they were included. They also were marked for the execution. The Bible says that Daniel then went home. He did what he did all the time. He prayed to his God in heaven. And it says he prayed all night. On the other hand, the wise men, they were up all night. They panicked. They couldn't sleep because none of their answers were coming through their medium. Now comes verse 19, chapter 2. That night, the answer to the mystery was given to Daniel. He went the next morning, and he presented himself to the executioner and said, call off the execution, take me to the king, I'll interpret the dream. But before these words are uttered, in the morning, when Daniel woke up, he kept saying after he got the answer, thank you, Lord, for telling me the dream and its secret. Thank you. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever. He knows all. He does all. He changes the seasons. and he guides history, and he provides both intelligence and discernment. Did you catch that? He took no credit for the answer that the king wanted and asked for. Now come with me to the throne room. The executioner addresses the king with Daniel at his side. Your Majesty, I have found the man. I don't know if you catch what's coming on here, but the executioner, he wants the prize. He wants the king to give him the reward for the lottery because he found the answer to his dream. Your Majesty, I have found the man. He comes from the exiles of Judah, and he can interpret the king's dream, verse 25. Hearing that, the king looks at Daniel. He says, are you sure you can do this? Tell me my dream that I had, and you can interpret it for me? No, Your Majesty, says Daniel. I can't. There is no one on earth that can do what you just asked. But there is a God in heaven, and he knows your mystery, and he solved it. And he told me last night what it was, because I just talked to him and I prayed to him. But he gets all the credit. I'm only here to tell you what he said. Daniel then went on and told the king what was coming and what was in the days ahead. What has this chapter 2 taught us in Daniel? Well, I think there are three things. Life's mysteries aren't mysteries to God. That's the first thing. 2, when you don't know life's secrets, ask God to tell you. 3, when God does his work, give him the credit. Hinduism in India, in our day, is the idolatrous superstition that Nebuchadnezzar had in his day. They believe the foolish notion that a person is born into 4 categories, and they call them castes. It's called the caste system. At the top of the hierarchy are the Brahmins. They're the priests. At the bottom, they're the laborers. You'd call them the blue-collar boys. But there was a 5th group, so unworthy, they didn't even fit in the caste system. They were considered outcasts. Their category was so low that they were called the untouchables. You can imagine the filthy tasks that they were to do in their living. All their lives, they'd be discriminated against, branded unworthy at birth, always unworthy in life, and always an outcast. One of them became a Daniel. Born a fugitive, born untouchable, unworthy, but he rose within the ranks of government to destroy the entire caste system that had condemned his people for so long. Let me tell you who he was and what he did. His name? Ramji Ambedkar. He was born April the 14th, 1891, in India, to a lowly, untouchable, outcast family. His father cleaned toilets for the military. There were 14 children in his family. The last child born was a boy. It was Ramji. He was their only child to go beyond the elementary school education. Untouchables weren't allowed to go to school. They couldn't have public education. They were outcasts, and those outcasts couldn't go to the caste system of the kids in that society of the Hindus. Do you know what Ramji did? He went to the caste school. He sat outside under the open window, and his classroom seat was his gunny sack that he carried there to the school. He heard the lessons through the open window for 8 years, through the searing sun and the pouring rain. And he passed the high school entrance exams, and he went to a caste high school, but even though he was a brilliant student, the teachers looked down on him, and he was shunned, he was ridiculed, he was beaten, and he rejected. But that made him all the more determined to succeed. Upon writing his final departmental exam, he graduated with honors. And he got a full scholarship to the Bombay University, and he graduated magna cum laude with the degree in economics and political science. Well, his education wasn't finished yet. He went to New York, Columbia University, and he got a degree in master's in economics. And his thesis was on the caste system in India, with the discrimination between the have-nots and society's privileged. That paper expanded to become a PhD. He got his doctorate. And he then went to the London School of Economics, and he got another doctorate, 2 doctorates earned. That's unthinkable. From a family of untouchables to a titan's position at the top of the education heap. It was now time to go home. Back to India. Ramji Ambedkar became a professor of law at the Bombay prestigious law school. But the nation of India, was a colonial state of Great Britain. On August the 15th, 1947, India got its independence. The newly elected prime minister was a man named Nehru. That new nation needed a constitution. The newly appointed chairman of the Constitution Committee of that new nation of India was, guess who? Ramji. Those new laws outlawing that wretched caste system were rewritten by an outcast himself and also an untouchable who was almost destroyed by them. And those new laws, written by his hand and protected by the rights of all Indian children, they could no longer now have to be called outcasts. The term unclean no longer exists in India's statehood. Ramji Ambedkar, like Daniel long ago, he interpreted a dream for the nation. From that moment on, no Indian child would ever again have to sit in his gunny sack outside a school classroom listening through a window in boiling sun and pouring rain. He could now go inside. His dream was interpreted. Our story gets better. Jesus invites all of you to come on inside. He says, if you will, I will in no wise cast out. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Enter thou into the joys of my Lord. When you come back next time, we're going to continue in the story of Daniel. And he's going to give us some insights that I think will really help us along in our journey. Because I don't think things are any tougher now than Daniel faced back then. And if he could do it, I think you and I can do it too. See you next time.